Um, I think the COVID-19 pandemic, global health emergency, has erupted into a political, humanitarian, and ethical crisis of unforeseen proportions. It has intensified and exposed pre-existing crises of capital, labor, welfare, caste, gender, climate, and so on. It has also been, I think, a moment to reckon with the various forms of vulnerabilities in the lives of millions of people, especially those who have been forcibly displaced and those who are working in the informal economy. On last Monday, the Labour Ministry admitted in the Parliament that it did not know how many migrant workers had died going home during the lockdown. So there was no question of providing compensation to their families. That's just a simple telling comment on social protection that's available to migrants. And since then, we have seen a relentless outpouring of reactions against what looks like a clear case of apathy against the working millions. In fact, since then, we have seen a number of areas in which the government has admitted of not having data, uh, giving a cartoonist an opportunity to re-christen NDA as no data available. I'll take a minute to talk about the significance of data in the context of what we are discussing today. When workers began to flee Indian cities in March during the COVID-19 induced lockdown, the country began to wonder exactly how many migrant workers there were, how many of them were daily wage earners, how many were in the informal economy, and so on. In an unequal world, uncounted people are not just missing data. In a democracy, failing to enumerate the vulnerable is a method to disenfranchise them. Absence from the state records means that the poor are omitted from welfare measures of the state. In Mumbai, for instance, it is clear that we do not know how many migrant workers serve the city daily. The initial estimate of migrant workers in Mumbai hovered around 8 lakhs to 10 lakhs. In May, the Hindustan Times estimated that about 11.5 lakh workers had left the city. Curiously, a fortnight before, the Indian Express unofficially pegged the number as high as 25 to 30 lakh. Other data gaps are also evident. I mean, we don't know, for instance, how many pregnant women in Mumbai slums had to deliver babies in their 10 by 10 huts since the lockdown. How many people had to take loans to buy ration or water? What exactly is the population of Mumbaikars living in slums without a ration card, a bank account, an Aadhaar card, and therefore are more vulnerable to a situation like lockdown? You have no data. Who are these migrant workers? The story of the so-called migrant workers is inextricably linked with the development, or rather the lack of development, in the rural parts of India, which results in continuous exodus of able-bodied men and women, sometimes even children, to towns and cities looking for a job. Migration in India is a one-way traffic. The urban people migrating to rural India for jobs sounds so bizarre. This is because we all have got used to seeing a pattern repeating itself generation after generation. To understand the phenomenon, it is necessary to delve deeper into the economic policies of India, which I must refrain from doing here, primarily because it is not something I know at all. It's well known, however, that the agriculture sector is India's largest employer. More than 200 million people, are engaged in agriculture. However, this sector accounts for just 16% of the GDP. The service sector, the logistic sector that Professor was referring to, is currently the second most important sector for providing jobs. There are more than 140 million workers in the sector. The sector accounts for 62% of the GDP, but is second in job creation. The third is the industrial sector, with over 110 million workers, and contributing 20% to the GDP. More people engaged in jobs that return less values in the market results in inequity. The rich will get richer, the poor get poorer. So we can have increasing number of billionaires. We had 138 by July 2020. And miseries multiplying for the majority simultaneously. We can have both of them simultaneously. Mumbai, for instance, has a new millionaire every 27th day, and half of its population lives in abject poverty. Data gaps have telling impact on our lives. For instance, because the authorities used the 2011 census as the point of reference to estimate the number of people who would be eligible for rations from the public distribution system, an estimated 108.4 million people, about 8% of India's population, were excluded from receiving benefits. This is because the system failed to count the large number of people who migrate to cities every week. Do you remember the ticker that runs at the bottom of our TV screens, keeping us informed every second how the Sensex is behaving, how the invested capital is performing, under which company, and so on? But we have no mechanism to count people who come to the city. Let me quickly refer to the phenomenon called disenfranchisement. The challenge posed by lack of accurate data are evident in the debates about the population of Mumbai's East Ward, your neighborhood. Through the government estimates, the ward's population is 807,000. Civil society organizations, however, believe that it could be anywhere in the excess of 12 lakh. This means that about 4 lakh people are missing from the official records in a single ward, a ward with the worst human development indices in Mumbai, a ward which is in which about 80% of its population lives in slums. 400,000 people do not figure in the government registers. Let that sink in. The people missing from the government registers have little claim or no claim to health, sanitation, or education. Shivaji Nagar, the largest slum clusters in the ward with a population of 600,000, has no higher secondary school or adequate hospitals and maternity centers. 46% of the area's children under 5 are stunted. This is an area where the absence of infrastructure forces more than 60% of residents to buy water daily. They spend about 12% of their meager monthly income to do so. Is it surprising that the average age at death, which is a proxy indicator for life expectancy, in this ward is 39 years compared to 57 for the rest of Mumbai? In a survey conducted by Apnale, the civil society organization for which I work, we found that only 46% of the households in the area had ration cards, and about 15% had no bank accounts. Over 33% adult population does not have a voter ID. During the lockdown, 81% people struggled for food, and 70% had to borrow money to buy ration and water. This is what happens when people don't get counted. The argument is simple. Disenfranchisement is directly linked with intergenerational marginalization. Who are migrant workers? They are citizens who have been denied a political self. India's millions of migrant workers share the predicament of many of slum dwellers of Mumbai. They lack a political voice. The fact that lakhs of people whose labor is key to running the city can be rendered dispensable overnight, as they were when Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced a nationwide lockdown at 4-hour notice on March 24th, suggests that they are not a political constituency that could force the government to negotiate, bargain for its welfare and rights. India's cities enforce a relationship of impermanence with the working poor. That is the reason why we have migrant workers, but never migrant managers or migrant CEOs. Imagine the situation if all the workers could vote in their destination state. This would give them greater negotiating power and thus better access to welfare measures. If all the slum dwellers, for instance, could vote locally, would they not be asking how the municipal corporation budget is developed, how much gets spent on their health, sanitation, or education? Let's ask the question again. Who are migrant workers? The migrant workers are workers, invariably engaged in the informal economy. It is the lack of a political voice that I was referring to earlier, an agency that makes and keeps the workers vulnerable. This trend was worsened since the advent of neoliberalism in the 1990s. The ease of doing business. Have you heard of this phrase, ease of doing business? A high ease of doing business ranking means the regulatory environment is more conducive to the starting and running a firm, which is synonymous with the weakening of workers' ability to negotiate either with the employer or with the government or both. Indeed, in the neoliberal world, it is becoming increasingly difficult to differentiate between bazaar and sarkar. This in turn puts enormous pressure on Samaj to facilitate process of social justice or social protection in this case. Why is it important for our discussion? Invariably, most employed slum dwellers belong to the informal economy, as does about 90% of Indian workforce, amounting to 415 million people. This simply means that informality, if it is of this nature, this scale, informality has been formalized or institutionalized. To make it worse, a worker in the informal sector has little or no support of a labor union. This is the last bit of my monologue. As per the latest National Labor Survey of 2016, the total number of registered labor unions has declined from 64,847 in 1999 to 12,392 in 2016. The difference between 64,000 and 12,000 is called neoliberalism or ease of doing business. There were 8.9 million workers who became trade union members in 2016, while the total number of workers in India stood at 487 million that year. In other words, only 1.87% of the Indian workforce are organized by trade unions. But we should note that only 40% of the trade union members belong to the informal sector. This means that barely 3.5 million Indian workers are organized in trade unions. This makes them invisible to the authorities, especially in times like these when they need social welfare and financial support to restart their lives. Instead, what do they get? When the lockdown pushed migrant workers into distress, many state governments were focused on repealing labor laws. 9 or 12 states, as per the last count, like UP, MP, and Gujarat, have suspended labor laws for the next 3 years. They have increased work hours and taken away their right to protest and claim to a life with dignity. Now, the question is, how can we rewrite this script? One strong indication was given by Professor Samadar. The disenfranchisement of many of India's urban poor has been a means of keeping labor vulnerable and cheap. This becomes possible because they are viewed by the state as illegal beings wherever they stay. This practice legalizes their exclusion. To empower the urban poor, we must begin with the unconditional inclusion of all the disenfranchised as citizens with rights. The process of registering a laborer must be made simpler. The role of the employer must be erased or minimized. The process of registration must start from the point of departure, for instance. A village panchayat or block office must have a record of all those leaving the village for work. And this must be digitized and universalized as soon as possible. I think it is time to acknowledge those who build and run our cities. It is time to recast the notion of urban citizenship. More poor vote in cities than the rich, and yet the cities decisively belong to the rich. This happens because the poor in the city seldom come together as a unified voice. The middle class living in a gated building complex, calling it a society, must question its transactional relationship with the workers. As long as they are considered migrants, they continue to belong elsewhere. It is time for the city, I think, to become their home. I'll stop here. Thank you.